Hello and welcome to the first episode of Dungeon Master U, where you are the Dungeon Master. My name is Dungeon Master Lee, and I am here to teach you everything that you need to know in order to run your first game of Dungeons & Dragons. Well, starting off strong out the gate, that was pretty good. Being a Dungeon Master is one of the most rewarding experiences that I have ever had in gaming. It can be so incredible to have a table full of people react to the things that you put before them in an incredible way. Having players gasp at a horrific situation, or moan at some damage that a player has taken, or become incensed with righteous anger at the actions of an evil NPC feels great. I'm not joking when I say dungeon mastering is probably one of the funnest parts of playing Dungeons & Dragons. So, you want to be a dungeon master. Maybe you want to try your hand at playing out a pre-written adventure, or you've had this fantasy world that you've been coming up with for a good couple of years now and never had a chance to put it through its paces. If you want to dungeon master your own game, that's an awkward verb, isn't it? Dungeon master, like master your own dungeon. Dungeoneer. That's what I'm going to use from now on. Dungeoneer. If you want to dungeoneer your own game... Does that work? I don't know. If you want to dungeon master your own game, but you're not too sure where to begin, don't worry. The following is a list of all of the things that you will need as base essentials to get your game up and running. Now, I do not guarantee that this is a comprehensive list of everything that you will ever need in Dungeons & Dragons, but this should be enough to get your hands dirty and to start having fun and making trouble. So, first part of this video, we're going to go over what you as a first-time Dungeon Master will need to know. The essential rules that you will need to know to play Dungeons & Dragons, and to run Dungeons & Dragons as a Dungeon Master. And a couple of useful tips and tricks that I have learned in my years of being a Dungeon Master. And finally, we're going to go over what to expect in your first game. Some basic player interactions, and some contingency plans in case things go awry. So, first things first, I want to talk about what a Dungeon Master actually does. There are countless interpretations of the job of Dungeon Master, and all of them are equally valid. There are so many different ways to run this game, and none of them are wrong. But on a base level, the job description of Dungeon Master is this. First and foremost, as Dungeon Master, you are the impartial rules reference. You're the resolution and the conclusion to every challenge that the players come across. You are not the opposing team. You're the referee and the sports commentator. As Dungeon Master, you make sure that every challenge the players come up against, every conflict they enter, plays out fairly. And though you do control the challenges, you aren't trying to beat the players. As Dungeon Master, you are also the challenges themselves. You're the person who decides how many orcs are behind that door in the dungeon, where the traps are placed and what their triggers are. You're the nefarious NPC who is trying to conquer the world through dark magic. But you are also the downfall of the NPC that is trying to conquer the world through dark magic. As Dungeon Master, you present both the challenge and the payoff for the players of your game. You, as the Dungeon Master, provide incentive to your players in the form of plot, in the form of interesting story beats. You provide treasure and character advancement. But the number one thing that you, as the Dungeon Master, are responsible for is making sure the world makes sense. As Dungeon Master, you are the representative of the living world in which your players are playing. You're everything from the shopkeepers they're buying from to the villains they're fighting. The monsters that they're hunting or that are hunting them. As Dungeon Master, it's your job to make sure that there is a reaction for every action that the players take. Whether that's having your players take damage from jumping off a high ledge, or whether that's getting your players punched in the face because they chose to punch someone. More than anything else, as the Dungeon Master, it's your responsibility to make sure that the world feels real. So how do you, as a first-time Dungeon Master, put together a game that feels real? How do you run a game that is successful and smooth, and has all of your players hooked and asking for more? Well, there are a couple of tools that can really help you along your way. And here they are! So, first things first. As a Dungeon Master, you need to know the rules of Dungeons and Dragons. And I don't mean to say that you need to have an encyclopedic knowledge of every rule in Dungeons and Dragons. I have been playing this game for 20 years, no joke, and I still have to reference the player's handbook on a regular basis. But one thing as a Dungeon Master that you should have well in hand is the basic mechanics of Dungeons and Dragons. The basic method of mechanical interaction in Dungeons and Dragons is this. Roll a 20-sided die. Add a number based on your character sheet, and try to beat a specific number that the Dungeon Master has in mind. That's it. Dungeons & Dragons is often portrayed as a much more complicated game than it actually is at its core. There are a bunch of rules that cover exceptions and asterisks and quid pro quos, and this is where, you have the Aladdin reference of Genie going like, a couple of quid pro quos, blah, blah, blah. But no, Dungeons & Dragons is rolling a 20-sided die and adding a number and trying to beat another number. This is done in a couple of specific circumstances, which are as follows. The first thing in Dungeons & Dragons that you, as a Dungeon Master, should have a firm grasp on are skill checks. Skill checks are used to resolve a situation, typically outside of combat, in which a challenge has an uncertain outcome. This could be everything from a player character trying to climb a wall to a player character trying to lie to a guard. This could even be something as weird and as specific as trying to figure out the right dinner fork to use at a high nobles dinner setting. That would probably be a performance check, or something of that nature. History, maybe? Actually, that's a good question. Regardless, how a skill check plays out is this. As Dungeon Master, you will decide which skill is applicable in this particular situation. So in our dinner setting situation, you'll decide whether it's performance or persuasion or deception, maybe intimidation, I don't know. And likewise, as Dungeon Master, you will decide the difficulty class of the skill. The difficulty class is the number that you as Dungeon Master have chosen to represent how difficult the task is. So an easy DC will be around 5 to 10. A more challenging one, probably about average difficulty, will be anywhere from 9 to 15. A particularly difficult skill check, the DC of something like climbing a rope in the middle of a thunderstorm with a blindfold on while people are throwing things at you, is going to be something around 20 to 25 maybe. So, as Dungeon Master, you have decided which skill is applicable in this particular situation, chosen based on the challenge at hand and the player's approach to overcoming it. You have also chosen the DC of this particular skill check, the DC being a number anywhere between around 5 to around 20, depending on how hard the challenge is. What will happen next is this. You, as Dungeon Master, will watch as your players roll a 20-sided die. Your players will add the number that they have rolled, plus the number of skill ranks they have on their character sheet. This is typically derived from their attribute bonus plus their proficiency bonus, if they get it. You will compare these two numbers. Then, you, as Dungeon Master, will decide what the outcome is of the situation. If the number your player has gotten is higher than the DC, then they succeed at the check. Play continues as normal, and their plan succeeds. If your players roll under the number that you have chosen as the DC, then they don't necessarily fail. When a player fails a skill check by rolling a number lower than the one that you have decided on as the DC for that particular challenge, then I often recommend having it be a complication rather than an outright failure. Their plan does not succeed, and they cannot try this same thing again. But play does not just stop. So if your players are trying to lie to a guard and you make them roll a deception check, then it's possible that they will roll under that. Sometimes that means that the guard is going to haul them off to prison. That's just a fact of law enforcement in the Dungeons and Dragons setting. Being locked away in a dungeon is something that happens. But the other option is to have another way for your characters to approach the challenge. One door closes, but another window opens. So, for example, the NPC guard does not buy your player's lie, but is amenable to some financial persuasion. He's willing to be bribed. He's totally fine with taking a bribe. It just feels so much better as a player and as a dungeon master to keep the game going rather than saying no outright. Now, there are exceptions to this rule. Some challenges are too hard to overcome even if you think up a really cool alternate solution. For example, if you're trying to decipher an ancient tome that you found in a desert temple somewhere and you just don't understand the language, then you don't understand the language and it doesn't work. That doesn't mean that every avenue has been shut off for your players, but it does mean that overcoming this challenge will take a lot more effort and a lot more thought on the part of your characters. But when in doubt, when your players roll beneath a skill check's threshold, come up with a complication, not a failure. So, that's skill checks. Anytime something comes up that's challenging, have your players roll a 20-sided die and add their skill ranks. If they get above a number, they succeed. If they get below the number, then their progress is impeded, but not necessarily cut off completely. The next thing that you as a dungeon master will need to understand are attack rolls. Attack rolls are very similar to skill checks, in that you are rolling a 20-sided die, adding a certain number, and trying to hit above another number. In the case of attack rolls, however, it is your attack modifier plus your 20-sided die roll, trying to hit above a target's AC. That's a lot of jargon. Let's break that down step by step. So, let's say a fighter is attacking a goblin. She rolls a 20-sided die, adds her strength attribute modifier plus her proficiency bonus. That is what we know as an attack modifier. Each character class gets a different attack modifier based on the tools that they're using to attack, their different abilities, and the focus that each class has. So, for example, a rogue might use dexterity as their modifier rather than strength. Regardless, it's typical that a character is going to be attacking using something they're proficient in, so they add their attribute modifier plus their proficiency bonus. You can see more information in the character classes section in the player's handbook. So, your player character, whatever they happen to be, rolls a 20-sided die, adds their attack modifier, and sees if they roll higher than their opponent's AC. If your player character rolls higher than their target's AC, then they score a hit, and they are now able to roll damage. This is where the other polyhedral dice typically come in for first-level players. In this case, each thing that a player is going to be attacking with will describe the type of die they are going to roll for a damage roll. So, our fighter, who is attacking a goblin with a longsword, will score a hit and then roll damage, which is going to be a d8, an 8-sided die. They will roll the d8, then add that number to typically their strength modifier. It's up to the player to add together all of the damage that they get. Don't worry about keeping track of this on an individual basis. It's good to be familiar with, but honestly, most players are more than happy to put together all of the numbers that they get to roll to inflict damage on your characters. Now, an important asterisk to any attack roll is going to be a critical hit. Critical rolls are when you or your players roll a 20 on a 20-sided die. This means a couple of things. First, it's an automatic hit. Second, it's going to accrue double damage. Now, there are a couple of ways to tabulate that damage that depend mostly on you, your preferences, and how you like to run your game. For me, I like to give the players a chance to roll double damage, which means rolling 2 sets of their damage die. This just feels fun. You get to have a handful of dice, roll them, and add up a bunch of numbers, and it just seems cool, you know? The other way to do it is roll once and multiply that by 2. There's a lot of different ways to interpret this, and none of them are right or wrong. Just go with your gut, and go with what seems fun. Regardless, a critical hit is typically cause for celebration, or crushing pain and lamentation when your kobold general stabs your player character through the eye. One way or the other, your players are going to have a strong reaction. An entire table of people will cheer as one for the extra damage that they will inflict on the boss monster. Or a table as one will lament the fact that your rogue is now a puddle of goo on the floor. Either way, it's great fun. Finally, the last functional mechanical rule that you as a dungeon master will need to know are saving throws. Saving throws are more of a reactive thing than a proactive thing. By that I mean, most of the time, saving throws are called for when something is about to affect your player characters. So, say our fighter is caught in an explosion. She'll have to roll a Dex saving throw. Or if she's just been bitten by a poisonous snake, then she'll roll a Con saving throw to avoid the worst effects of the poison. When something calls for a saving throw, a player character will roll a 20-sided die and add their saving throw bonus. Each character class is proficient in 2 types of saving throws. That's a solid across the board. This means that if it's a saving throw they're proficient in, they will add their attribute modifier plus their proficiency bonus. Otherwise, all other saving throws are just your attribute modifier. So, if your player character rolls above the save DC, then they have a chance to either mitigate the effects of the thing that has been leveled against them, or they get to avoid them entirely. A lot of player character spells will call for a saving throw on your behalf to make sure that your NPCs can avoid some of the damage, maybe not all of it. And that's it. Those are pretty much the rules that you need to know to run a game of Dungeons & Dragons. There are a couple of things to look up, like assisted skill checks and contested skill checks and so on and so forth, but the basic mechanics are the things that I have just told you about. Everything's a roll of a 20-sided die, add a number based on a skill or an attribute, and then see if you can beat a particular number. Again, you as a Dungeon Master don't need an encyclopedic knowledge of the rules of Dungeons & Dragons. But you do need to know enough to make a call that seems fair and equitable. If you're not sure about a particular rule, common gaming wisdom has it that you should make a call in the situation, whatever the call happens to be. And then, once you reach a pause in the action, or even go home for the night, then you should look up the rule and play by that later on down the line. This way you keep the game going, and make sure that the action never really slows down. But what about the more wibbly side of things? What, as a first-time Dungeon Master, will you need to know to run a smooth game outside of the rules? One of the most fundamental concepts in Dungeon Mastering is the idea of yes and. Now, this is an idea that comes from improv theater. It's the idea that you should never stop the action of a scene. Rather, you should always try to do something to keep the scene going. Anytime someone posits something, if your players have a really weird, silly idea, you, as the Dungeon Master, should say, yes, go ahead. I, as the player, want to train an army of cockroaches to steal the crown jewels of this particular kingdom. I, as the Dungeon Master, will say, cool, give it a try. Not only do the rules of Dungeons & Dragons give you the opportunity to do a lot of really crazy things, but honestly, a lot of the time, the rules of Dungeons & Dragons make it pretty easy. Or at least possible. So if your players come up with an unconventional solution or try to do something outside of your playbook, you as the Dungeon Master are better served by saying, yes, you should try and do that, than saying, no, you can't do that. Now, the other side of that coin is no but. This comes up when something is just a little too audacious and a little too weird or out there for it to come off successfully, or for it to be possible at all. So, say the plan that your player characters have come up with is impossible. It's just not going to happen, either because it's too challenging, or because it's just not within the bounds of the situation that you have presented. Something that you, as a Dungeon Master, can say is, no, you can't do that, but here's an alternative. Something closer to that situation that you have tried to present to me, but that is more within the terms of the world that I've created. Can I pretend to be a storm giant? No, but you can pretend to be a storm giant's servant. That's entirely possible. Can I identify this magical item without the appropriate scroll or spell? No, but you could experiment with it. The idea behind yes and no but is to keep the game moving no matter what. It's not to get your players to go down the exact path that you have set, but to make sure that your players can find their own path through the world that you have created. The idea behind these is to let your players engage with the world on their terms, to make their path viable, and honestly, to make your job easier. So, as a first-time Dungeon Master, remember this. When in doubt, yes and, or sometimes no but. Next piece of wibbly advice that I really like for first-time Dungeon Masters is show, don't tell. Now, if you've ever taken an English class, you've heard this. It applies here too. When you're DMing your first game, it can be tempting to just say, your players run into a group of 4 goblins. But that isn't the most engaging way to present it. Instead, try saying what the goblins smell like. The first thing that the players perceive of the goblins. Like, say they're walking down a path and they smell manure and burnt rubber. They hear the tiny feral chittering of an unfamiliar language. They see little prints in the mud of the road, little tiny humanoid footprints and discarded bits of trash, tiny pieces of dead mice, and things that goblins like to carry along with them until they get bored. Presenting the things that the players perceive is so much more engaging than summarizing what the players have encountered. And honestly, it's a lot more fun for you too. So if it's a dank dungeon, then talk about the water dripping from the ceiling and the cracks in the cobblestone floor. Talk about the smell of mold in the air and the centuries of decay that your players are disrupting. When they come up against a chimera, talk about the foul breath of the creature. Talk about the weird movement of the 3 different heads. This is an opportunity for you as a dungeon master to really have fun. See it in your mind and talk about what's there. This can be a challenge. I'm not going to lie to you. It's a skill that has to be developed, but it can make your game feel so much better to your players than anything else on the table. So, show don't tell. That's what that means. Next up, as a dungeon master, an important rule is to never force your players into anything. This comes into play in a couple of different situations. First of all, in a gameplay way, this means don't force your players down any particular plot point. You can start them off and you can provide incentive, but your players are in charge of their own destiny. That's the whole reason you're here. Now, if your players don't do a particular job, they might not get paid. But if your players don't follow the call of their own adventure, then they might not have fun. In gaming terms, this is called railroading. It's oftentimes seen as a no-no. It has its place, but it can really impede a player's enjoyment and sense of agency. Likewise, this concept extends to the real people sitting at the table, as well as the characters playing in the game. Don't force your players into material they are not comfortable with. If they're not comfortable pretending to be somebody else, then that's fine. They can just say what their character does. You can encourage your players to do certain things, and you can try and get them to feel it out in whichever way they feel comfortable with, but at the end of the day, it's their game too. Finally, and this is one of the biggest stumbling blocks that I have heard when people try to start playing Dungeons & Dragons, both as a dungeon master and as a player, it is so tempting, especially if you're playing homebrew content that you've been working on for years and years, to present an encyclopedia to your players. But I can tell you that there is no bigger turnoff and no bigger barrier to entry than a lore dump. Seriously, all of the stuff that you are presenting to your players can get overwhelming. Remember, this is their first time existing in this world. It can be really hard for new players to jump into a world with too much stuff. Instead, as an alternative, try this. There's something in writing called the iceberg theory, where I don't know how true this is in real life, but the metaphor is that 90% of the iceberg is underwater. All of the stuff in your setting exists. It's out there in the world. But the players might only ever see a very small part of it, especially in the tavern where they're meeting for their first adventure. So you can have your unique race that is maybe made of rocks sitting at the bar, but they don't have to understand where this race comes from and what they do and what their worldview is. They can just see them at the bar, see them drinking what they drink. If they're interested, they can go talk to them and be like, hey, who are you? What are you? What's your story? That's the magic of role-playing games, is your players now live in your world. They would know exactly what you know about your world. What I mean to say is they would know exactly what a normal person would know about Earth. You don't know everything there is to know about Earth. There is so much stuff on Earth. And though you have Google, you might not even know the search terms you need to cover even 10% of stuff on Earth. The same goes for your player characters. They exist in this world, and they would know what a normal person would know, but they don't need to know the minutia of your magic system unless they seek it out, and sometimes they seek it out. At the end of the day, save your lore dumps for when a player character seeks them. Don't make understanding the lore the barrier of entry for playing your game. Especially for players who are less interested in the role-playing aspect and more interested in the just tabletop aspect of Dungeons and Dragons, this can be a really high hurdle to try and jump. So those are my big guidelines for first-time Dungeon Masters. If you try and keep those in mind, you're doing a good job. Don't worry about hitting them all the time. This is more of just something to aim for. We have yes and the other side, no but. We have giving a description of the things that the players are coming up against and trying to avoid easy summaries. We have meeting your players at their level of comfort instead of trying to force them to play by your terms. And we have letting them exist in the world as normal people, not making lore a barrier of entry. So that should give you enough technique and knowledge to really get your hands dirty and start having a good time. Now, all you have to do is play the game. The last section of this video is less a hard and fast rule and more of just notes from the front that I have had to go through and learn, and it was all hard-won knowledge about playing at a table with other people. Because that's what Dungeons and Dragons is. You're playing at a table with other people. You're all working together to build this story. Sometimes it doesn't go as planned. After all, you're sitting at a table with a bunch of different people all trying to collaborate on one project. Each person has their own perspective, their own likes and dislikes, their own goals and motivations. Each person is approaching your table in their own unique way. So the following is a list of some things to keep in mind, some contingency plans for when things go wrong, and some general guidelines for interacting and shepherding this group of people. First, there is no main character in Dungeons and Dragons. Or rather, everybody is their own main character. Think of it less as like a hero's journey type narrative like Star Wars, where Luke Skywalker is the main focus of the action and there are cool characters around him, but, he drives the plot, he's what everything hinges on. And think of it more like Ocean's 11. It's a heist movie in which each person has their own individual part to play. Each person has their own thing to overcome before they can play that part. And more than everything, every player character has their own story. It's important when playing at a table with a group of individuals that everybody sees themselves as their own main character. You're playing at a table with a bunch of people. That's what it is. You're playing with a group of individuals who have their own motivations and things that they want to get out of the game. Now, since you're playing at a table with a bunch of individual people with their own motivations trying to get their own individual kicks out of the game, you run the risk of people trying to trash your story. I asked someone recently who was about to DM their first game what they were concerned about, and what they said was, "What do I do if one of my players kills an important NPC?" This is a really good question. This is another one of those that I feel is important to have an entire video to address, but for now, as a first-time Dungeon Master, the advice I can give on the subject is this. If a player tries to mess up your story by killing someone important or ignoring the plot hook or any other number of unpredictable things, let them. This can be a really scary thing as a first-time Dungeon Master, but it's important to remember that everybody is at the table to collaborate together. Though you might have this entire story worked out in your mind with plot hooks and NPCs, cool monsters and amazing set pieces, your players might not engage with it. The way I look at it is this. No matter what your players do, the events of your plot will happen regardless. Sauron, if the ring was never carried to Mordor, would have done his evil plan. Like, he would have taken over the world. I don't know. I always go for the Lord of the Rings and Final Fantasy VII wells, which is weird because I've never read The Lord of the Rings, and I don't remember the plot of Final Fantasy VII. But in all of these stories, no matter what happens, the evil mastermind behind the dastardly plot might get their way. They'll try to do it anyway. And so, Let's say your player characters are at a tavern and they're presented with a plot hook. Like somebody's sister went missing and they're supposed to find him. And the players are just like, I don't care. Then that chain of events leading up to finding the sister and the sister's involvement in the rebellion and the essential plot that the rebellion was involved in to keep the evil king from getting their way, all that stuff happens anyway. The players have a chance to engage with it and alter the outcome of the events, but there's a thing that is going to happen. There's a villain who is trying to influence the events of the world and get their way. If the players don't engage with it, maybe they get their way. That presents all of its own interesting situations. I mean, if the hobbits never threw the ring into Mount Doom, then Sauron would take over the world. The roads would get worse. Orcs would begin hunting travelers on their way to and from Rohan, and stuff would start getting real bad. As Dungeon Master, what you should keep in mind is this. No matter whether or not the players engage with your plot, the plot will play out. As Dungeon Master, you kinda have to call your players' bluff. If your players don't take steps to alter the course of the events presented, then the events presented will take the course that they would have without your players' engagement. But let's say we take it one step further. Let's say there's somebody in your party that just wants to trash the world. In Dungeons and Dragons terms, this is called a murder hobo. Somebody who has no concern for the hierarchy of the world and who is walking around killing and stealing and having a wonderful time, but disregarding the elaborately crafted plot that you have put together. Again, I say to you, call the player's bluff. If a player is running around and killing people willy-nilly, then you're totally allowed to sick the law enforcement on them. In fact, that can become a really fun game. If your players are murdering and stealing and generally just being chaotic evil, you're allowed to have the King's Guard try and track them down. Maybe there's a nemesis character that you can create trying to bring an end to their reign of destruction. Maybe the evil wizard tries to recruit them because, goodness me, they're an effective force of chaos and death. Have the world react to your players, no matter what your players are doing. If your players are trying to be murder hobos, if they don't care about the law and order of the world that you have built, then that's fine. Have the law and order care about them. But there's also that one step further. This is a small minority of players, so honestly most of you won't ever have to think about this. But, just in case, some players try to trash your game deliberately. Sometimes a player character will try to be disruptive and it's going to become an issue. A lot of people at the table are there to play the game, and if you're trying to indulge this one person again and again and again, then nobody's gonna have a good time. If a player is becoming more and more disruptive and it's throwing everything off, feel free to take them aside and be like, hey man, look, what can I do to help you enjoy this game? Because clearly you're not engaging with it on a one-to-one basis and everybody else wants to have a good time. Everybody else wants to collaborate and build this thing and it doesn't seem like you want to. So what can I do? How can I help? What can I provide to you as a player to engage you? Sometimes that doesn't work, but you'd be surprised at how often it does. Just be honest and forthright and make sure that everybody has a chance to have a good time on their terms. At the end of the day, there isn't a hard and fast rule for interacting with players at a Dungeons and Dragons table. I can't tell you what to expect because everybody is going to have their own experience. There are as many ways to play Dungeons and Dragons as there are players and Dungeon Masters, which is to say there are a lot of ways to play Dungeons and Dragons. The best advice I can give you is this. Feel out your table. See what your players enjoy and don't enjoy. And don't be too hard on yourself. If your players seem to react negatively to something you're very proud of, don't worry about it. Just take a look at it and feel free to ask your players why they didn't like it. Remember, this is your first time DMing. Don't expect critical role. Expect to have fun with your friends. So that's it. That's Dungeon Mastering 101. That's everything that you, as a first-time Dungeon Master, need to know to get your hands dirty. Next episode of Dungeon Master U, we're going to go over your first sessions. Your Session 0 and your Session 1. The difference between the two and what you can expect to include in both. If you have any specific questions or particular issues that you'd like me to cover, please send me a message on Twitter or leave a comment below. But for now, this is Dungeon Master Lee saying, you got this. Keep adventuring. Whoa, I just zoned out there for a second. Sorry. 20. I was trying to get to the 20. I was trying to find the 20 on my D20. You're the person who decides the impartial resolution of all of the challenges the players... Jesus. Wait. Unless your players are complete jerks... Let's not say that.